It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of Political Science at George Washington University at the Elliott School there, Henry Farrell, who you also can catch blogging at places like Monkey Cage and Crooked Timber. Welcome to the program, Henry.
I'm delighted to be here.
So we're talking about your piece that you had in Aeon magazine. I hope I haven't mispronounced that. We have a link at majority.fm. And it is about the attempts, I guess, to put into practice what we hear quite a bit, particularly on this program, from libertarians about an unregulated marketplace, free of the monopoly on force by a state. And you start with a place called the Hidden Wiki. What is that?
Well, the Hidden Wiki is one of a variety of sites and also places on forums like Reddit, for example, where you can find the basic addresses that allow you to reach hidden parts of the Internet. You need these addresses together with a special browser called the Tor Browser, and together you can use them to access these websites in ways that make it pretty hard for people to monitor that you're accessing them, and also make it very hard for you to figure out where the website that you're actually accessing is located.
All right, and so now I think our audience is somewhat familiar with the Tor browser, but in the context of more sort of like dissident and civil liberties work. But tell us exactly what the Tor browser does, and talk about that divide, I guess. There are two different sort of worlds that use it.
Yeah, very much. Well, there's a variety of different people who use it, and one of the problems, of course, is that because you cannot monitor who's using it, it's very hard to get a good sense of what uses it is being put to, and so you see a lot of dueling arguments and statistics going back and forth. But effectively, on the one hand, Tor Browser is a wonderful tool to have if, for example, you are a dissident in a non-democratic regime. It allows you to access the Internet without your governments being able to tell what is happening. And so, for example, if you look back to the Arab Spring of a few years ago, you saw a huge increase in use of the Tor browser happening from Egypt precisely because people wanted to figure out what the hell was going on without their government being able to see what websites they were accessing. But also, by the same token, if you want to avoid government surveillance because you're interested, for example, in dubious criminal activities, Tor also provides you with the same kind of privacy, the same kind of freedom from surveillance. So it's a double-edged tool, like many technological tools, which has very positive and perhaps sometimes negative consequences too.
All right, so let's talk about what sort of grew out of that, and you talk about a dilemma that Tor presents, I guess, for some of those folks who want to engage in behavior that they don't want the state to see because it's illicit.
Well, I think that this is what it really does is it sharpens and accentuates a problem that all criminals have, which is fundamentally you do not, by and large, if you're a criminal, you're probably not a particularly trustworthy individual, and if you're dealing with other criminals, they're probably not trustworthy either. So you are always trying to figure out how it is that you can make sure that you can protect yourself from the people who you're doing business with, and they also are probably trying to figure out the same kind of thing with regard to you. So that, for example, if you look at the Sicilian Mafia, the Italian sociologist Diego Gambetta has written a lot of wonderful work about how profound distrust is between mafiosi because they simply do not know that they can trust each other. And so what the Internet does and these anonymous browsing techniques do is that on the one hand they allow criminals to avoid the oversight of law enforcement, but also by the same token, these criminals are also anonymous to each other, which makes it much harder for them to trust each other, and which means, for example, if you're trying to do a deal with somebody and that person then screws you over, you probably are going to have great difficulty in tracking that person down, and hence you are probably not going to want to do business with people. And so from the perspective of a criminal, you are in a world where it's awesome because you're able to avoid law enforcement, but where you may have great difficulty in finding other people to do business with because you don't trust those other people, and they don't trust you because you don't know who they are. You can't retaliate if you're cheated, and so on.
And we should say that it's also it's the anonymity which makes it hard for there to be any recourse, and that recourse, I guess, dilemma is there also is sort of embedded in the libertarian ideology in some way. I mean, I spent a protracted hour discussing this with a libertarian professor named Walter Block, where we were talking about what happens if someone steals someone's wallet, and their vision, or I should say his vision, at least from a libertarian perspective, involved his courts, my courts, a third-party court to adjudicate the validity of his court and my court, and then presumably a series of sort of ascending courts, all of whom have only the validity coming from whose court really seems to be able to solve things, and that there's a quality that exists here with that. It's not just, I mean, a middleman of trust, which grows out of this, but also a means in which that middleman to actually have, I guess, some measure, some ability to provide recourse or consequences for a breach of that trust.
Well, I think that that's absolutely right. And let me just say two things first of all. First of all, that there are a lot of very smart libertarians out there who also think about these problems in a much more serious and much more nuanced way. And secondly, even when libertarians have crazy utopian ideals, there's nothing wrong with having crazy utopian ideals towards a world in which you can engage in free exchange without anybody being able to stop you from doing it. This is something that the left, I think, has these tendencies towards utopianism. But I think that the particular problem with the libertarian conception very often comes from the fact that the real ideal of many, albeit not all libertarians, is market exchange, and markets in their ideal form are based on purely impersonal exchange, where you do not care who you're doing business with, they do not care who you are, and you're somehow able to consummate and transact these kinds of economic relationships. The problem is that in real life, you need to have somebody out there to try and make sure that you behave in trustworthy ways towards each other. And if you do not have an effective way of doing this, you find yourself in trouble. And this is why some pretty conservative economists, such as Doug North, for example, have argued that having a well-functioning state is incredibly important. Some libertarians would obviously like to try and get away from the state and come up with purely private means of ordering, which you would not have to have any state with enforcement and with the weight of military and police power behind it. But these schemes, by and large, seem to me to collapse for fundamental reasons, because they're really trying to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps.
And I don't want to diverge too much from the story, because we have a lot to cover here. But the notion too that these things, people enter into these market relationships, as you say, that one doesn't care. They're not really personal relationships. It's perfectly fine if they're anonymous, because it's just about the goods, and it's also driven by maximizing, right, the value that someone gets in these markets. So the idea of ripping somebody off, the only consequence in that, I guess, in that ideology is that, well, people aren't going to do business with you next time because you're going to get a bad reputation. And but the interesting thing about what has happened with Silk Road, and we'll get to that, and we're going to get to that now, is that it's not enough that you have a bad reputation, particularly if you're anonymous, because, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And so what I do in the article, I steal a bunch of ideas from some very smart game theorists. And one of the things that game theorists have discovered, it is possible to run market relations purely on the basis of reputations, but only as long as you have a pretty small pool of people who are interacting with each other. Once the pool gets too large, things begin to get too unwieldy. And so you need some kind of centralized enforcement mechanism in order to make sure that information is properly provided, that people who cheat are properly punished and whatever. And the problem is, of course, that as soon as you start to build up that central organization, you begin to look more like something which is less free-flowing, less libertarian, and you gradually begin to look more and more like a state.
All right, so tell us about Ross Ulbricht.
So Ross Ulbricht is a very interesting character. He is a Texan. He is a very, very strong and committed libertarian, and he is also somebody who's got a secret identity as the Dread Pirate Roberts, a name which fans of The Princess Bride will recognize. He set up a marketplace online called the Silk Road, which was hidden on the secret internet, made a very large amount of money, facilitated a lot of drugs transactions, and has recently been convicted for doing this. He was caught by the feds, and is, I believe, about to try and appeal and get a new trial. And I guess we will see what happens with that. But as of the moment, is convicted on what appears to be some pretty strong evidence.
So talk about how Ulbricht built his business.
Well, he started from a pretty small level. He effectively started as a dealer of hallucinogenic mushrooms. He set himself up. He clearly had been thinking about this for a while. He had been talking to people. His diaries and other material which is available suggest that he had this idea for this online drug market, and he started by selling his own product. The product was clearly pretty popular. He came across as being a relatively trustworthy individual in a environment where a lot of people were not trustworthy, and people started to go to him, and then he started to work less and less selling his own stuff and started more and more to become a broker between other people, setting up this market, running this market, at first not taking any commission on the deals that he was doing, and then only turning it into a for-profit business model once he had managed to establish sufficient trust in his own reputation, and also by so doing had become a kind of a middleman of trust, as you noted earlier, between these people who otherwise would have had great difficulty in trusting each other.
You post in your piece a comment from the hidden Wiki that I just love. I feel like it would be unfair if I read it without at first giving you the chance of reading it. But if you don't have it in front of you, I will read it because I think it really sort of shows the dilemma that people had in this instance, and sort of what fueled, I guess, the growth of his intermediary business.
Well, this is a guy who was looking to try and find stolen credit card numbers, which is another very popular business that Ulbricht was not involved in. There are these forums for credit card scammers, which tend to be much more focused on professional criminals dealing with other professional criminals than the kind of thing that Ulbricht was doing, where you saw a mixture of dealers and amateurs together. And so you have this comment from a guy in the hidden Wiki who says, "I have been scammed more than twice now by assholes who say that they're legit when I say that I want to purchase stolen credit cards. I want to do tons of business, but I do not want to be scammed. I wish that there were people who are honest crooks. If anyone could help me out, that would be awesome. I just want to buy one at first so I know that the seller is legit and honest." And so, as you say, I think this is an incredibly funny statement. I just loved it when I first read it. This was the moment in which I knew that I had an article that I wanted to write. But so this guy out there, he's looking for stolen credit card numbers, and he just wishes he could find people who are honest crooks.
And we should reiterate that he capitalized "do not," I do not. So in the event that you were about to scam him with a fake set of stolen credit card numbers, understand that those capitals would, of course, stop you dead in your tracks. I mean, the amazing thing about this comment is that's like basically holding up a flag saying, incidentally, if you're going to scam me, I'm the guy you're looking for. If you're looking to scam somebody on credit card numbers, I'm the guy you want to scam. Just make sure you give me one good one, and then after that, you'll be in great shape. I imagine this guy or gal has had quite a go of it.
I would imagine, and he posted it in a forum which is a pretty notorious place for finding sharks of one variety or another. But that also points to one of the ways in which people very often do rip other people off. They build up trust with other people over a period of time, slowly building up a reputation until the moment when they can go for the big hit and basically screw over a whole bunch of money or a whole bunch of people at the same time and flee with their money.
So, inspired by Murray Rothbard, Ulbricht declared his intention to use, quote, economic theory as a means to abolish the use of coercion and aggression amongst mankind and to build an economic simulation that would let people see what it was like to live in a world without the systemic use of force. And so, I guess Silk Road was pretty successful at its height, yes?
Silk Road was making money hand over fist at its height. Now, how much money it was making is hard to say because all of this money was being made in Bitcoin, and the exchange rate at which Bitcoin can get turned into regular money fluctuates wildly and rapidly. But the U.S. government has been selling off various amounts of Bitcoin, which it has seized from Ross Ulbricht's accounts, and we're talking in the tens of millions of dollars at the least.
Wow. Okay. And so he basically this was going well, but then what starts to happen?
So I think that this starts going too well in a certain kind of way. That if he starts off small and he finds himself becoming this pirate king of the internet. He names himself the Dread Pirate Roberts after a pirate from the film The Princess Bride. He starts getting grandiose notions about how much money he can make and how at the same time he is forging this fundamentally new set of social relationships which are going to transform everything. He clearly thinks that this is the burgeoning of a new revolution. And so you see mixed in with all of the profit-making activity, you see that he's also engaged in doing things like setting up Murray Rothbard reading groups on the website, is clearly trying to sell a philosophy as well as sell a product. And I think he begins to get sucked into his own fantasy. And I think this is a problem with a lot of libertarians. You see a lot of this in a much milder version. For example, one good version I think of this is Glenn Reynolds, the libertarian blogger, has this wonderfully lunatic book from the late 2000s, An Army of Davids, in which he proposes that there's all of this untapped military expertise and potential out there because of all of these libertarian bloggers who are avid wargamers, and once they are able to unleash their creativity and intelligence upon the world, warfare will never be the same again. And so I think you see something like the same kind of fantasy unfolding in Ross Ulbricht's mind, but because he's making huge amounts of money, because he's getting interviews with Forbes magazine, because he is, in a sense, a minor but very real celebrity, he's also getting affirmation and feedback from the world which seem to support his fantasies and which seem to support his sense that, in fact, he is changing the world and that he is a world historical figure.
How sort of like... what was the awareness? I mean, he's being interviewed in Forbes. Was it as a guy who's overseeing sort of a site where there's a lot of illicit trafficking going on? I mean, I'm trying to piece in my mind when I became aware of Silk Road and to what extent that was just a function because he got busted, or when he goes to Forbes, do people know who he is? I mean, how explicit was all this?
He's already gotten talked up a lot in the press. So really what happens is something like the following. He managed to set this up. It begins to attract attention among computer people, people who are interested in Tor, interested in these issues, and a couple of places start to write about him. And the idea of this flourishing drug market being run by this colorful guy beyond the reach of the law, it's clearly a wonderful journalistic story. And so you see journalists beginning to write about it, and then you see questions starting to be asked in the U.S. Senate about why it is that this guy is getting away with this. It becomes a political cause célèbre. And this also has the function of feeding a lot of attention onto the Silk Road, so that if you are somebody who's looking to, I guess, score some drugs, and you would like to do so in a reasonably safe way, you hear through the grapevine, because this guy has gotten so much publicity, that you need to fire up the Tor browser and look for the secret address of the Silk Road, and so it becomes a kind of self-perpetuating phenomenon, a kind of feedback loop, which makes the Silk Road bigger and bigger and more controversial, until, of course, the controversy begins to eat up the profit model, and you see the whole thing crashing to a halt.
And the big vulnerability, as you write about, was that it's one thing for me to go on there and try and buy some drugs, but it has to be delivered to me. So I have to give my address to the drug dealer. And the problem with all this is that now there's some lack of anonymity, and it's up to the drug dealer to, I guess, under the rules of Silk Road, the drug dealer was supposed to get rid of your address immediately, but there was no way to enforce that rule.
That's exactly right. And I think if you look at this, the story of Ross Ulbricht is not of somebody who is a super competent technological hacker. He was clearly quite good at what he did, but he basically taught himself from scratch and made a lot of mistakes along the way. The story is of a guy who is really, really good at getting people to trust him. At one stage, he says, I recognize that your trust in me, to his customers. He says, I recognize that your trust in me is what keeps this site going. He was really good at getting people to trust him and at leveraging that to get them to trust each other. But the fundamental problem with all of this is, as you say, that it's necessary in order to send drugs. You've got to send them by the post, and you do not know whether or not the person who is mailing the drugs to you is or is not keeping tabs on the address that he is sending the stuff to, and very probably he is going to keep tabs because it's going to be simpler for him. It's going to be easier for him to do this, and this creates a major vulnerability because Ross Ulbricht can make rules saying you are not allowed to do this, but there is no real way of enforcing those rules except if a person, as happened indeed once on the Silk Road, admits that they kept a list of addresses, which then gets out through an unexpected means. And so you have this huge vulnerability, and also it's a vulnerability which can be used deliberately in order to try and blackmail and undermine the Silk Road. And that, I think, is when things really begin to start going south for the Silk Road, is when people begin to start doing this kind of stuff.
And we should say, as a drug dealer, it makes absolutely every sense in the world to retain those addresses, not just for convenience, but also you never know what they could be of value to. There's absolutely no value to you to destroy those addresses, other than to say there's value in saying, like, I did destroy them, but there's no value in actually destroying them. So what happens then with the friendly chemist?
Okay,
who turns out not to be so friendly? I guess that proves my point. Easier to say you're friendly than actually to be friendly.
Okay, so this is a very messy and very complicated story, and we're not quite sure exactly what happened. But from what we can piece together, it's something like this. Some person who calls himself the friendly chemist says that he needs a lot of money in order to prevent a massive number of addresses being leaked publicly. He has a complicated and convoluted story involving a relationship with another drug dealer, but he also is somebody who clearly actually has access to the addresses that he says that he has. And so he starts looking to Ross Ulbricht saying, unless you pay me a large amount of money, these addresses are going to get leaked. And so then what happens is that Ulbricht starts getting in contact with somebody else who claims to be a member of the Hells Angels and who gets involved in a conversation with Ross Ulbricht about the possibility of rubbing out Friendly Chemist and later a few other people who are purportedly collaborators of Friendly Chemist. And as best as we can tell from the diary entries and from the other evidence that was entered in during the trial, Ulbricht starts getting involved in this conversation with this Hells Angel person, pays a substantial amount of money to get the Friendly Chemist killed, pays a substantial amount of money to get other people killed, and sees himself as, so basically as having taken care of what he seems to be pretty cold and dispassionate about, as best as can be told from his diary entries. He's taking care of a business expense. Now, the twist of his tale is that there's no evidence that anybody actually ever was killed as a result of any of this. And perhaps the most plausible explanation is that both Friendly Chemist and this mysterious figure who offered contract killing, that they are associated in some sense, or may indeed be the same person, masquerading under different identities. Whichever which way, Ulbricht pays out a lot of money because he sees the need to plug what is a very, very serious gap in his system.
Now, I'm curious as to the extent that this guy is still doing sort of, I guess, seminars or with Murray Rothbard or promoting the ideology on Silk Road. How does that? I mean, is there any indication that he's sort of drifted a little bit from his intention to use economic theory as a means to abolish the coercion and aggression amongst mankind? Because that seems to me to be contrary to that, hiring a hitman to kill somebody who's not following the rules.
It is indeed a contrast, and there is absolutely no connection between the two. On the various Silk Road forums, Dreadpire Roberts, Ross Ulbricht's pseudonym, is maintaining a story of basically that he's a drug-dealing Jesus. So this is a sort of a peaceful, wonderful thing in which we will all continue to work together in order to avoid the clutches, what he calls the thieving, murderous myths of the state. And that it is possible to do all of this stuff just relying upon markets and markets alone. And he seems to have some vague ideas that he propounds about how it is that over time markets will emerge in protection as well as in other things, but he really doesn't, he basically argues that there's no reason why we need to fear organizations like his turning into anything like the oppressive state, because they will be disciplined by market incentives not to behave in ways which would lead to their users being harmed or hurt or whatever. But indeed, it turns out that quite secretly he has been engaged in some some pretty cynical efforts, as best as can be told from the evidence that was entered in the trial. He's been engaged in a very deliberate effort to see people who he saw as being dangerous to his business interests get killed.
So has there been any reckoning of this? I mean, the thing I love about your piece is it obviously sort of provides this, I guess, cautionary tale of where this ideology can lead. But has there been any reckoning amongst? I mean, you write, I think, in the piece at one point, like, the Silk Road was part ideologically based and part just sort of about greed. To the extent that there's any remnants of that community that was ideologically based, was there any reckoning with this? That like, oh wow, here is a really good example of what is problematic about this notion that we don't need for a market to really function on any sort of, to be scalable in any way. We don't need some entity with a monopoly of force.
So far, to my knowledge, there has been no serious response in the few weeks that the article has been written and out there. There's been no serious response from libertarians, which frankly comes to me as a surprise because the story of the Dreadpire Roberts is a catnip. I thought that this was something where it's going to get some good, solid, interesting, provocative counter-arguments from libertarians who would explain to me patiently why I was wrong, why I had gotten this theory wrong, why it was that this kind of order was indeed something that could be maintained without the state. But so far there's been more or less no response from libertarians whatsoever, which surprised me a little bit. But it may just be that it's a kind of an awkward story. If you want to present yourself as being the people who are going to provide liberty and justice for all, you can maybe kind of you can maybe kind of reconcile this with having a drug dealer as being a hero because, of course, you are somebody who believes that it should be possible for consenting adults to freely buy and sell drugs to each other. But when the guy appears to be a fantasist who's contracting out hits to people who may or may not be actual contract killers on the side, it becomes, I think, a pretty tough sell. So my sense is that libertarians have been sedulously ignoring this story in the hope that this would go away. I do hope that I read some pieces from some of the more interesting and thoughtful and smarter libertarians out there on this, because I would like to see some good arguments starting to get going on this.
Yeah, exactly. And I, it's not a question of of Ulbricht, right? I mean, it's really hard to see how anybody could deal with this. I mean, that's always strikes me as the fundamental flaw in this idea that you don't need anyone other than sort of the market forces to regulate these things, and we see that. I mean, we see it in practice all the time. It's not as sort of a clean sort of illustration as this is, but was there anything in, like, I don't know, forums? I don't know how much time you spend in there, but I mean, I'm just surprised that nobody there was no reckoning at all with this, that there was no sort of compulsion for someone who was engaged in Silk Road or saw the value of it, from an ideological standpoint, sort of get out ahead of this and say, oh, here's why that failed. Nothing, right?
It's surprising. And you can see libertarian arguments, especially from people who recognize that there is a role for the state, but they want to keep it as minimal as possible. You can see libertarian arguments that I think could usefully push back against mine, but so far people, at least to my knowledge, have not done this, or if they have done this, they haven't gone to any lengths to bring it to my attention.
Well, hopefully somebody will do that soon. Henry Farrell, the piece is linked at majority.fm. Thank you so much for your time today. Genuinely appreciate it.
And thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun.